good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on which continent you are logging in from. Hopefully the weather where you are is as nice as it is here in Brussels. And since those of you in the audience do not need to show themselves, for all that I know, you can be sitting on a beach under a palm tree and enjoying a cocktail, which of course you are very welcome to. I'm very proud on behalf of the Egmont Institute to announce today's online event on the occasion of the publication by Georgetown University Press of the book called Diplomacy and the Future of World Order. And we will hear from the editors of the book, plus a number of the chapter authors and one of my own colleagues at the Egmont Institute. I was very, the title of the book and the basic idea immediately appealed to me because it seems to me it's one of the few optimistic publications out there about the state of the world. One reads so many pessimistic papers that start from the idea that China is rising, America is the established power, inevitably they must clash, and inevitably everything will get worse and worse. And here at least we have a set of authors who try to think well, is that necessarily true? And can we not find ways for the powers to work in concert still? Of course, powers can work in concert. Doesn't mean that on some issues they will still not stay competitors or even rivals. And hence the title of today's webinar, A Concert of Rivals, which I may use again, since plagiarizing yourself is allowed for my next policy brief. So welcome to everybody. A warm thank you in advance to our speakers. And I will briefly tell you from whom we will hear. I will in a moment pass on the floor to Van Hampson from Carleton University, who will give us the opening remarks of the webinar. Then we will hear from his two co-editors of the book, Chester Crocker from Georgetown University and Pamela Ahl, who's at the United States Institute of Peace. And then we will hear in this order from Daniel Benjamin at the American Academy in Berlin, my colleague Nina Willen, colleague at Egmont, but also at Lund University, and finally from Anna Palacio. Unfortunately, Dimitri Trenin from the Russia office of Carnegie in the end had to cancel his participation. But I think I can safely state we still have a sterling panel. So I look forward to a fruitful discussion. I'm very grateful to all of you that you wanted to share your insights with us, and I pass on the floor to you, Sven.
Well, thank you very much, Sven, and I want to thank you and the Belgian Royal Institute of International Affairs for organizing this conversation, which, as you mentioned, is centered on a new book, The Future of World Order and Diplomacy. But we're not here to talk about the book. We're here to talk about some of the key ideas in the book. The book was the result of a multi-year project. Its contributors are a distinguished group of international affairs policy analysts, practitioners, academics from around the globe. We had several workshops where various iterations of the chapters were presented and then subject to extensive peer review. And I think all of you who've been through that peer review process know that it's always nice to see a book come out of it. Most discussions today are about two kinds of diplomacy, great power diplomacy and how to manage emergent strategic rivalries among the great powers of the world, some of which are rising powers, others of which some argue are failing or declining powers. And And that's sort of, one variant of the conversation about diplomacy. The second is how to bring about a return in a post-Trump era to traditional forms of multilateralism, which are centered on the UN and regional organizations. And what the book argues, and you'll hear more about it from my colleagues, is a third variant, which is referred to as concert diplomacy. It's not 19th century concert diplomacy, but a new kind of concert diplomacy, which has a variable geometry and plays on different chessboards, and we see emergent signs of that in a number of different issue areas. That's just by way of introduction, and I want to, as I said, once again, thank you for organizing this, and turn things over to the panel.
Let me jump in.
Yeah, please go ahead, Pamela.
Sorry, I'll jump in here. Pamela All, also one of the co-editors. And I want to echo Fenn's thanks to Sven and Nina and the Egmont Institute. It is terrific that we have this opportunity this is the first opportunity we have to talk about the book publicly, and it's great that it's taking place in Brussels. This book was a very long time in the making. I think we formally started thinking about it in 2015, certainly 2016. As we were thinking about it, things kept on changing. As we were trying to conceptualize what the book would be about, the international environment was changing all the time. And for those of us in the United States, our whole approach to international affairs was changing on a daily basis. So, I think we felt we really are living in a time of constant change. But it's always good to remember that probably every generation feels the same way, that they are living in an era of unprecedented change. So while it is important to be looking at peace and conflict diplomacy at this particular moment, it's worth also recognizing that the themes that we will be talking about are pretty universal. One, how do we deal with change in the international system? Two, how do we prevent and resolve the most pressing global problems that we face today? And three, how do we achieve sustainable peace? So with that, I will turn over to my colleague, Chet Crocker.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you. Again, thank you to the Egmont Institute. My colleague, Fen Hampson, has said that this is not only about a book, but it is partly about a book. So being a shameless salesperson, I'm going to hold up a copy of the book, and there it is so everybody can see it. Diplomacy and the Future of World Order. The purpose of our discussions is, of course, some of the ideas in the book, and ideas that we've all been thinking about and writing about in our various professional capacities. As Fen noted, we have 3 scenarios in the book, and every chapter in the book comes to grips with the 3 scenarios or 3 types of futures. A kind of a rough geopolitical confrontation scenario, which might, in the eye of some, be a return to a Cold War way of thinking about world politics with the US and China in a confrontational relationship. And the US and Russia, in some respects, confronting each other about some very basic issues. That's scenario 1. Scenario 2, as Fen said, is the famous liberal rules-based order. Can we go back to it? In which ways and in which respects can we go back to it? Do we all want to go back to it? There's obviously more than one view on that. And scenario 3, which Fenn referred to as variable geometry, is the prelude really to talking about a concert approach, which I will say more about in a minute. It could also be called a la carte multilateralism. That's kind of what it is. But I want to emphasize that the focus of all the chapters in this book is on peace and conflict diplomacy. We're not talking in this book about trade negotiations or negotiations about aviation safety. We're talking about peace and conflict diplomacy. And what does that mean? To us, it means, first of all, managing great power competition. Secondly, managing other people's conflicts in third areas. One thinks of Libya or Yemen or Kashmir, for example. And thirdly, managing threats to the international system, to the international order itself. There one thinks about the challenge of terrorism, for example. So another thing that's interesting about the way this book evolved is that we have chapter authors who represent and speak about all the major regions and some of the major powers, as well as some of the major functional challenges that we face in the international system. So this book is not a book of predictable talking heads all sitting in New York or in Washington or in London. It's actually kind of a global book. And many of the chapters, of course, most of the chapters were not written by us as editors. They were written by our chapter authors like Anna Palacio and Dan Benjamin, whose views you'll hear shortly. The authors in the book do not all agree with each other, which makes it for an interesting read. But we drew a lot from our authors. I think we probably all do agree on some of the main challenges that we face in the international system today. And I'll just tick off a few of the ones that are, I think, front and center in all of our minds. The decline of trust and faith in all kinds of authority, all forms of authority. We live in a world in which algorithms have replaced experts or threatened to replace experts. And that's a very challenging reality. There is a lot of volatility and polarization and normative contestation, normative disarray. And yet, ironically, we are very interconnected technologically, and we're very vulnerable technologically because we're so interconnected. Thirdly, as was hinted at a moment ago, some of the traditional security providers, including the US, have been inward focused recently and very inwardly focused, facing lots of very major inward internal challenges, and therefore inclined to be reluctant perhaps to engage in lots of ambitious external political initiatives. So those are a few of the points. I think we could also stress the fact that some of the mechanisms for coordination between major powers are under stress, or they've been left to go into disuse. If you think about strategic stability, for example, between the US and Russia, some of the mechanisms that had been in place are no longer in place in terms of military and arms control stability. We think of the Open Skies Treaty, and we think of the INF Treaty, and even things like the Incidents at Sea Treaty, which goes back to the 1970s. It still exists on paper, but it's not used in a serious manner by either the US or the Russians. When it comes to the US and China, and I heard a China expert speak to this quite recently, there is literally no edifice of military to military coordination and crisis management mechanisms to try to keep things from going onto the boil. These are just a few of the challenges we face, not to mention the role of armed non-state actors, the complexity of today's conflict arenas, thinking of the multiple parties that are involved in a place like Yemen or Ethiopia or Libya. So the big question in our discussion for today is peace and conflict diplomacy possible and likely to thrive and survive under the kinds of scenarios that I mentioned earlier and that Fen mentioned in his introductory comments. So under a scenario of geopolitical contestation, what kind of diplomacy will we see? One could argue, as we do in the conclusion, that we'll see a diplomacy of transactional and opportunistic attitudes, diplomatic attitudes by major actors. When I am asked for an example, I would say, well, think of what President Bolsonaro did when he said that he would save the Amazon rainforest if the other countries would pay for it. I mean, that's the ultimate example of transactional diplomacy. Or maybe an even better example is when former President Trump offered to buy Greenland from the Danes, which didn't go over too well in Denmark, as I recall. Under the liberal rules-based order, if it returns, we'll see a much stronger focus, again, a return to a focus on values, the values agenda, including obviously human rights issues. So there'd be a greater focus on how to prioritize human rights during the transition in Afghanistan, or what to do about the mess in Venezuela, and how do we get beyond Maduro, or how to stand up and protect and hold close the Good Friday Accord in Northern Ireland, which is so very important to the security of Europe. So that's an example of the kind of priorities, diplomatic priorities you would see as we, and if we return to more of the liberal rules-based order. So let me talk in conclusion about variable geometry, or the model of a concert diplomacy. I think we co-editors would agree, and I don't know if everybody in the book would agree, but we can find that out from Dan and Anna in a moment, that this is our best hope. It's our best hope is a kind of concert approach to diplomacy. Now, what do I mean by that? I do not mean a return to the 19th century concert. That is unrealistic, and it is unnecessary, I would argue. We already have a UN Security Council, and we already have the P5 within the Security Council. So we're not talking about that. I think what we're talking about is not a single concert to manage the world, but rather ways in which combinations of countries can do a better job of working together cooperatively to support the UN, for example, on various issues. We already have a UN Security Council. We don't have to reinvent it, but we do have to complement it. We have to backstop it. We have to help it do its job by, if I can use the term, pre-cooking issues in informal concert mechanisms before they go to the Security Council. The Security Council remains, in my judgment, vital, and it plays a vital role in entrenching decisions of the international community, endorsing them and legitimizing them. But it's not fit for purpose as the first port of call. Quite often, it's necessary to arrange through dialogue, through diplomacy, that the concert exists through a concert mechanism in other fora. Now, do we mean a single concert? No, we mean cooperation without institutions, ad hoc mechanisms that enable countries that are liberal as well as countries that are authoritarian to work together to solve problems that they share. And of course, there are many problems that countries share, whether they're liberal or authoritarian. And we mean concerts at various levels and various sectors of the international system. So there could be concerts that are issue specific, for example, on COVID relief. There could be concerts that are very focused on specific challenges, like terrorism. And maybe there is an informal concert. Maybe Dan wants to say something about that. We could have concerts by region. There could be a concert mechanism stood up to deal with the crisis in the Horn of Africa. There could be a concert mechanism to evolve for the crisis in the Northern Triangle in Central America. And anyway, these are just examples of what we mean by a concert. A concert is a way to cooperate without institutions, without formality, in order to be able to develop diplomatically areas of consensus, which can then be legitimized and endorsed in other fora. So I think I'll stop there. I've said enough to whet at least some appetites, hopefully. And I'll turn it back to you, Sven.
Thanks a lot for that introduction that already raises many questions in my mind, but I will abstain for the moment and pass over the floor to Daniel Benjamin, please.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank the Egmont Institute for the invitation. And I also want to thank Chet, Pamela, and Fen for inviting me to participate both in the event and to contribute to a volume that I think is quite important. So I'd like to make a few points on what I see as the outlook for both counterterrorism cooperation and for terrorism itself in a period of change in the global order. And I will try where possible to say which of the different models offer particular opportunities and possibilities for ameliorating some of the challenges we'll face as I go along. This is, I would say, one of your classic good news, bad news stories. Today, I would say there's broad agreement in the global counterterrorism community that the threat of high-end catastrophic attack by jihadist terrorists has been greatly reduced by the many lines of efforts that have been pursued since 9/11, those involving kinetic force, law enforcement, development, and other means. I think most counterterrorism professionals would agree that the likelihood of attacks involving weapons of mass destruction or a campaign of attacks meant to destabilize particular societies are a lot less likely than they used to be. I think as we found out on 9/11, however, you can never say that such an attack is impossible, but I think it is nonetheless considerably less likely. The caliphate has been destroyed, and even if there are still remnants of it outside, both in the area of Western Iraq and Syria, but also elsewhere, border security, especially in the US, but also in many other countries, has been significantly improved. I think it's worth emphasizing, however, that this is very much a Western perspective. Global terrorist activity, including in different parts of Africa and the Middle East, remains quite significant, lower than it was a few years ago, but overall quite high in historical perspective. We have a number of outstanding problems that can account for this. One of them is state weakness in Africa. Another, and perhaps the biggest of all, is that the fundamental drivers of jihadist terrorism continue to be very strong across the broader Muslim world. And there I'm talking about repression, corruption, economic insufficiency, lack of democratic institutions, and the like. We don't need to talk about that at any great length in this particular forum. I would add that one caveat about this outlook is that we have seen the rise of white supremacist terror, which is well known to everyone. And I I'd like to think that the habits and the infrastructure of cooperation can make a difference here, and that it can be dealt with effectively. It's worth noting that networks of this kind have historically been easier for law enforcement to penetrate. We saw that in the US after the Oklahoma City bombing. But that said, institutions often adapt more slowly than we would like. And although we always say that strong states ought to be able to do at least two things at once, it is depressingly the case that that is not always true. So that is a real problem that is out there, and we can't rule out the possibility that other brands of terror will also emerge. So how did we get to this point of relative success? I think that the unique nature of the global network that works on terrorism is a big part of that. That is, in a sense, a kind of concert, to use Chet's term, because it doesn't rely on the international institutions that have otherwise been so important in the liberal rules-based order. The core institutions are intelligence services, and they operate in secret. Their stock and trade is bilateral exchanges, bilateral relations, bilateral cooperation. There are always issues between intelligence services, but they operate beneath the surface of political disagreements. And since pretty much no one in the world wants to see jihadist terrorists succeed today, the impetus for cooperation is good, and the ability to look past political differences is great. I think the baseline is that most countries are extremely forthcoming with serious threat information, no matter what the political relationships are between the partners that are sharing this information. I think it's worth pointing out here, since we're talking about a world in which, contestation seems to be increasing. I want to say a word just on Russia and China. Cooperation with these countries by Western powers is and will remain minimal for a number of reasons. The main one is that these countries have wanted to use counterterrorism cooperation as a way to learn more about Western intelligence capacities. That is obviously a big problem and makes those intelligence services extremely wary of close cooperation. The other point worth making is that some countries, and I think this is true of the Western partners, believe that counterterrorism is an activity best done, to use a frequent metaphor, with a scalpel to minimize radicalization. Others believe that it should be done with a chainsaw to intimidate opponents, and there is a big chasm here. And that chasm exists between the US and Russia and the US and China, and it's not going to go away anytime soon unless there's basic major league reform of those governments. The use of counterterrorism as a label or as a aegis to find information to help repress domestic opponents is a big barrier to cooperation as well. What is going on in Xinjiang is going to make it very, very difficult for the US to really ever cooperate with China, and I'm not sure there's a lot of call to do so. So it's worth, of course, adding that there is lots of counterterrorism cooperation outside the intelligence sphere that will be at risk in a more competitive international order. Diplomatic efforts to deal with insurgencies, to detach groups that are less extreme than the hardcore radicals who are often driving things, those will become more difficult and require more ad hoc improvisation and more concert-like diplomacy. We could all see border cooperation becoming at risk in some areas. Multilateral coordination in terms of, for example, UN sanctions, programs to counter violent extremism and the like, all these things could be imperiled. And of course, there's unlikely to be any global initiative to deal with the big drivers that I spoke with before. No one had the money to do so when things were when there was a greater sense of urgency a decade or so ago. There wasn't talk of huge economic packages or efforts to use such packages as leverage against corruption or repression. And it's hard to imagine that will be possible in a world in which there is greater competition. I think it's hard to imagine in a world in which the liberal rules-based order makes a dramatic comeback. To sum up, our ability to treat the symptoms is going to remain, the symptoms of the global problem underlying terrorism, that is, will remain significant. I think our intelligence agencies continue to see this as a major mission. But strategic change is unlikely, and future waves of extremist violence can't be entirely excluded, though I think that the defeats terrorists have suffered are noteworthy and will have a depressing effect on their near term. So let me turn now to what I think is the other big story, and which I think probably will be of more interest to this audience. And that is that we are seeing what I believe is as terrorism carried out by non-state actors like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, are going to eclipse. I think what we are seeing is a return to the kind of terrorism that we saw years ago, which is to say state-sponsored terrorism. When I first went to work on the counterterrorism portfolio in the White House in early 1998, this was what we were most worried about. We were just a couple of years past the Khobar Towers bombing, a decade past Pan Am 103, and a lot of other less famous, less dramatic attacks in between. For the most part, that phenomenon receded primarily because of the ability of countries to attribute authorship of these attacks and to exact a price for them through economic sanctions. So state sponsorship, in short, diminished, and then we saw the very rapid rise of the non-state actors such as Al-Qaeda. Now, it's worth underscoring that there are two areas of state-sponsored terror that have remained resilient throughout. One of them is Iranian-sponsored attacks against Israel. The other is Pakistani-linked groups against India. These have been, if you will, resilient islands against the global trends. So what is the evidence for this recrudescence of state-sponsored terrorism? You could start by making the argument that the kind of hybrid warfare we saw in Russia's takeover of Crimea, which involved essentially people operating without the uniforms that we expect in classical warfare, and the use of a range of tactics, including cyber sabotage and the like, all are a powerful indication of that. I think there are many others, and I actually think that the case for this revival of state sponsorship has strengthened since I turned in my essay. And I note that I tortured the editors by turning it in at the last possible moment. So a few things to mention. And it's actually amazing to me how little discussion these different incidents get in the press and in public circles. So in October 2016, Russian intelligence agents sought to take over the parliament in Montenegro and assassinate the prime minister. Russian GRU officers have been tried and convicted in absentia. This seems to be a pretty well nailed down conspiracy. Czech authorities, have we just learned in the last few months, have now asserted convincingly that Russian operatives were behind attacks on Czech weapons storage facilities in 2014. And the consequence has been that most of the Russian delegation in Prague, I think, has been sent home. It's not just Russia. I think when we looked at the forced landing of the Ryanair plane in Minsk and the seizure of journalist Roman Protasevich, I think a lot of learned people have concluded that this is an act of terrorism, and certainly in its violation of international norms, it appears to be. There has also been an extraordinary rise in the use of assassination as a tool of statecraft. And here, the Russians are the current champions with a trail of carnage from Litvinenko back more than a decade ago to Skripal, and a number of oligarchs who have come to untimely ends or have just escaped it after being grievously wounded. I think one of the key events, however, that led me to think about the revival of state sponsorship was the killing of Jamal Khashoggi by the Saudis. And it's worth noting that there has been public reporting on at least 3 other regime critics who have been targeted for assassination, but who appear to have evaded their would-be assassins thanks to the help of the countries that they have sanctuary in. Iran has begun targeting regime critics again abroad. North Korea, of course, used the chemical agent VX to use Kim Jong-un's brother in an airport lobby. Finally, Turkey has been conducting a global campaign, and I'm moving on from assassinations, but has been carrying on a global campaign of what might be termed renditions, extraordinary renditions, abductions, to bring home Turkish individuals who it considers part of the Gulenist opposition. Turkish officials have spoken of returning at least 80 individuals to Turkey to face charges. One of them was apprehended, a cousin of the cleric Fethullah Gulen, who was living in Kenya in just the last week. So let me make a couple of closing observations here. Assassination isn't entirely new. Israel's been targeting its terrorist enemies abroad for decades, and a loophole in US counterterrorism policy has meant that Israel has not been designated as a state sponsor. That loophole is if you're not already a state sponsor, then assassination is not a terrorist act, and we can debate whether that's sensible policy. But what I think is beyond debate is that the rise in the different activities we have been seeing add up to an attack on international norms. So while our mission in this book is to project different scenarios and how the international activity in these areas would be affected by these different scenarios, I think that to some extent some of our chapters underscored which direction the wind is blowing. I think it's also just as a matter of prognosis or prediction, it's worth recalling that the last time that relations between the West and Russia or the Soviet Union was this bad, Moscow supported a range of leftist groups, including the Baader-Meinhof gang and the Red Brigades, that killed many more people in Europe than the jihadists have. And what is the interesting evolution here is that now they seem to be doing it without the cutout groups. Those groups were indigenous, endemic, sui generis, but the Russians were very good at, or I should say the Soviets were very good at using them. So what I think is interesting is that we are seeing states react to these events on an individual basis, often with great vehemence. But there's been no coordinated recognition of this phenomenon, this broad-based attack on the norms of international behavior, and there has yet to emerge any resolve to call it out as a singular phenomenon and to enhance the penalties for this behavior. Now, it's early days, and so far as the Biden administration still doesn't have most people in office yet, and perhaps they will see this as a phenomenon to be combated and will enlist the support of others. The EU has certainly shown some solidarity with the Czechs, for example, over what they experienced. But you know, I would say that the future looks like one of more great power competition, and that perforce is going to lead to some concerts and some failed concerts. And my own fear is that when we do have concerts, some of the music is going to be more contemporary than classical. Why don't we put it that way? Less harmony than we would like. And I will stop right there.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Again, I have to refrain from acting, And instead, I will pass on to my colleague Nina, who's the director of the Africa program at Egmont. Nina, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for letting me participate in this webinar, which is a bit off the topic from my usual research expertise. So I will take up on what Chester said, that this is a global book, and then come into what Daniel talked about the weakness, state weaknesses in Africa, and zoom in a little bit on that and the major conflict-related developments on the continent during the past few years. And then I will try to adapt two of the types of diplomacy practices that were outlined in the book and show how these have been used both to instrumentalize and to stabilize these conflict trends on the continent. So the post-Cold War African state system has evolved towards models that place greater weight on democratic governance standards, the rule of law, transparency, and so on, especially with the introduction of the new regional security framework on the continent, the Africa Peace and Security Architecture, which clearly has been inspired then by liberal norms and policies of a liberal peace paradigm. But we've also seen how the practice is quite different from what's happening. The theoretical ideals are different from what's happening in practice, especially in terms of conflict development. So since the end of the Cold War, Africa has experienced disproportionately large number of armed conflicts. You can count conflicts in different ways, of course, but the Uppsala conflict data program is stating that there have been approximately 630 state-based and non-state armed conflicts on the continent between 1990 and 2015, which is a quite enormous number of different conflicts. What characterizes the political context to these conflicts is a low level of freedom of expression, democracy, and civil liberties, what you talked about before about the values, that has been characteristic of these conflicts. And we can see also that 67% of Africa's population has experienced a deterioration in levels of freedom of expression during the past decade. So this evolution in conflict has not been linear, however. So between the 1990s and up to the late 2000s, Africa underwent a reduction in number and intensity of armed conflicts. But since 2010, we have seen some disturbing upward conflict trends again. Most notably, and Daniel was touching upon this, the expansion of terrorist threats in Africa. Although it has been globally decreased in Africa, it has increased during the past 10 years, especially then in northern Nigeria, which has involved Boko Haram, one of the most deadly terrorist groups globally. The civil war and the NATO-led intervention in Libya, the resurgence of rebels and various jihadist insurgents in Mali, in a region which generally has seen an extreme deterioration of security over the past few years. We've also seen in CAR and Central African Republic the involvement of great powers like Russia through private security companies. And we've seen how Al-Shabaab in Somalia has maintained a threat throughout the region in the north and east of Africa. And then we've also seen a deadly civil war in South Sudan. So these types of conflicts could be categorized in many different ways, and I will just pick one of the ways here. You could divide them as taking place in two types of worlds of conflicts. So one that's rooted in the African state system and which involve governments and their challengers. So basically fighting for state power. And then the other types of conflicts which occur on the margins or outside of the society of states, fought for reasons that don't involve state power. That, of course, includes many of the non-state actors that Daniel was mentioning before, including warlord factions, clans, tribes, criminal networks, and terrorist organizations. This second type of world, the one outside of the state system, is particularly problematic for different types of diplomatic practices and interventions, as the diplomatic system, in essence, is a state-based system. So we can identify two types of basic diplomacy that were actually presented in the book by Fenn, Chester, and Pamela for these armed conflicts. Firstly, then, what they have categorized as the competitive and instrumentalist diplomacy, which basically is used by the major powers to support proxy forces or to defend interests or spheres of interest, which I have seen especially with Russia and Libya and CAR, for example, but also a second type of diplomacy, like the stabilization diplomacy, which involves activities that are aimed at stabilizing and de-escalating conflict through, for example, sending special envoys or peacekeeping troops to maintain peace agreements or negotiated ceasefires. And that we've seen especially in the Sahel, and the most recent example is Mali, where we have a major peace operation, MINUSMA, which is one of the largest one currently operating. But we've also seen counter-terrorism operations in this region, again showing this aim for stabilization, which has become somewhat of a buzzword, both for peace operations more generally, but also different types of counter-terrorist organization operations like Barkhane. So the central precept of stabilization diplomacy is the importance of state sovereignty and the belief that state sovereignty should be preserved, and that that's the key then to regional and international order. And that is, of course, problematic in areas where the state lacks legitimacy with its population, as again, as Daniel was mentioning, the African state weakness. In certain areas, the state is basically lacking legitimacy with its population because it's unable or unwilling to provide the basic services to its population. So notions of rebuilding or reinforcing the state kind of fall on becomes problematic because the state is not really the actor that's providing security for the population, and the state lacks popular support. And so in these situations, I'm thinking that the third basic diplomacy practice that was also introduced in the book, which was called governance diplomacy, which is more aimed at activities undertaken by non-state actors or state actors, but where sovereignty is not the main goal to preserve, where you try to promote the expansion of human rights, civic rights, and greater pluralism. A little bit like Chester was talking about the concert diplomacy, where you actually try to put together different types of actors, but without any formal institution. And perhaps that is the way forward, even in these areas where there is conflicts and armed conflicts and wars that go beyond the state system. But I will finish on that, and I have a lot of questions for the authors later on during the discussion.
Thank you, Nina. Last but not least, we turn to Ana Palacio. Ana, please.
Well, thank you, Sven, and thank you for the Egmont for hosting this event. Well, of course, I must begin by expressing my gratitude to the coordinators of the book, to Chester, to Pamela, and to Fenn, for having asked me to write a chapter on Europe, which if we are in a mutating world, because we are in a mutating world, wow, Europe, you know, we are in the mutation within the mutation, and for good reason. First, on what has been said, to just add a few comments on the framework. Yes, just every generation thinks there has never been an upheaval like the one we are living through. But this upheaval, it has a peculiarity, is that for the first time, we have a competing system to this Western inspired liberal order that is based on principles that have nothing to do with ours, which is the Chinese system. This is it's at a cosmic distance, even from the positioning of the communism that had many roots in common with what is the liberal thought. In the end, there are links there to the Enlightenment. But China is there. We have to take into account that China is bringing forward concepts that are absolutely alien to our ground concepts. And just to mention one that is not controversial per se, but is very disturbing when you put it in the framework of international public law or institutions, is the concept of harmony. Harmony in our legal system doesn't have a meaning, it doesn't have absolutely not the transcendence that it has in China. So we could go on and I could spend my intervention on this big difference. And I think that we have to take stock, as you have very well said, of where we are, what do we have to do with this international liberal institutions and rules-based system in order to make it work for the present. My second comment, it's yes, the key here is this emerging rivalry, let's put it just on rivalry, between the United States and China that could go forward as a new kind of Cold War. Honestly, I don't think so, because again, the interconnectedness that we have seen and that is not close, this idea of decoupling is, I think that we can discuss it in academia, but in real terms, it's much easier said than done, is there. But there is another key element of this, of this G2 or these two big poles of attraction, and I won't go beyond that, but two poles of attraction: China with an emerging, very powerful system, and the United States. Is that the United States is not what it used to be. The era of Pax Americana is gone. And this, for what we are discussing in this book, this idea of the role of diplomacy in areas that are not, of course, it's linked to trade, it's linked, but in areas of security and defense and politics in its core concept, it's fundamental, the leadership of the United States. And of course, we have, again, we have to see that Trump has undermined the institution of the presidency of the United States and frankly of the United States. There is a matter of trust. In Europe, we really don't trust that the United States will not go back to a Trumpist or an America isolationist, not, honestly, blaming and contradicting and aggressing and belittling its allies, which we have seen. And this is fundamental for the way forward. Now, if I just a few brush strokes, but to set the pieces. If I go to the United States, the Trump is the first thing. The second thing is that, frankly, what we are seeing from Biden, and we have to understand this, is that his administration is first priority is internal priority. It's this big investments, this middle class, growing, not growing, but with a division in the society. You wish to see a better evolution, but what we see is that the woke dash this idea that in the current universities there is an unrest. The unrest in the United States is the first issue, and of course, this administration has to see to midterm elections. So what the Europeans saw in the election of Biden is that we could, if not go back to the good old days, have a new impulse in this leadership of the United States that we wish we understood that it was going to be a convening leadership, a leadership that would count on allies. Well, okay, we are going to see the President Biden in Brussels in a week now, or in 10 days now, and we will see it's extremely important to work on this aspect of trust, of just Europeans feeling that this leadership that takes allies for granted has changed, that there is a convening leadership. Now, I won't go into it, but there are certain ideas like the D10, this idea of alliance of democracies, and this goes to values and to principles. This is something that we have to discuss. In Europe, we don't see this because we don't see who can just credit if you are a democracy worth participating in this effort or not. We are more to try to use formats that are existing, like the G7 or other formats. I leave it there. Now, on Europe, because I'm not going to speak about the world without speaking about Europe, we are going through a similar social unrest, social self-questioning, social not seeing the future, even more in Europe than in the United States. Our woke movement, or it's an extremely polarized in other aspects, but it's there. This idea that you are saying of the demise of authority and the replacement of authority by algorithm is present among us. So we are now facing 18 months or more with two major elections. One of them in France, it's extremely volatile. In Germany, of course, now Green Party is, I would say, mainstream of the mainstream. But again, we are in a transformation that is not easy for a fundamental challenge that we have, is that Europe must decide what we want to be together. Because for the moment, we only take real decisions, political decisions, forward-looking at the 11th hour. It was true in July when we reached an agreement to create this big fund for the post-COVID recovery, the future of Europe recovery fund. But it's also true of the agreement with Erdogan that we reach on immigration. We don't have, as institutions, and this Europe is a construction of law and by law of institutions. So it's the best expression of this liberal rules-based institutional order in a microcosm. And therefore we are a workshop, and the problems we have are interesting to analyze from this perspective, not to scale them up because we will find other complexities. But if we cannot find good solutions among ourselves when we have many things in common, it's complicated. And what we see is in the area that interests us more, which is international relations, foreign affairs and security and defense. What we see in terms of diplomacy, you analyze the visit of the high representative to Moscow, or the encounter of the top brass of the European Union institutions with Erdogan, and you see that there are clear shortcomings of diplomacy when power is not behind these diplomacies. and this is this idea of convening of convening power that I was saying, but this idea that you mentioned of just a new concert in Europe, we have gone through big successes of diplomacy. Even now, the GCPOA was an EU3 launch, so it was Germany and France and the United Kingdom in those days. Of course, I haven't mentioned, but in this area of foreign affairs and security and defense, the fact that the UK has severed its ties from the European Union is a big, I mean, it's a big issue. Let's put it this way, it's a big issue. But going back to the role of diplomacy, there we have seen what this new conference of powers diplomacy could give, with something that you have hinted at, is how we get things moving forward in the Security Council. There, the sanctions with Iran were Security Council imposed, and the agreement that was reached on the nuclear program was fostered in the first place by the European Union. Of course, the European Union was just establishing this core negotiations that had to be conducted in the end by the United States in the first place, Russia and China and the P5 in general terms. So this is something that we have to keep in mind, because in my opinion, it's a prototype. It's a prototype of what we can do realistically to use the institutions we have, because frankly, starting from scratch is not an option, but use it realistically. And I think that we have to I mean, we can have takeaways from these prototypes. This is one. The other one, frankly, is the Paris Agreement on climate. This is another example of what you were saying of concert of powers. This is not international public law. This is UN framework, but it's a different issue. So, what was the role of the European Union in these two prototypes? Again, we were the keepers when United States was interested in other issues, when your attention was concentrated on other issues. The Europeans kept the flame, and in both issues it was the same thing. The GCPOA, so the agreement with Iran, started in 2003. So it took over 10 years to mature, but it matured. And right now, it's again the European Union that is bringing back or trying to bring back this new administration in the United States and just renew or bring back to life the GCPOA. In the Paris Agreement, it's exactly the same thing. The Europeans, because we are a normative power, we have been there, but we haven't been able to bring anything forward until we have had the attention and the full potential of the United States. So I don't want to keep much longer. Of course, we could go on and on, but if I summarize, seen from Europe at this moment, absolutely yes, Chester, you are right. We need to find different ways. We cannot just go back with the classical approach of international public law and of the institutions the way they were created after World War II, because the world has nothing to do with post-World War II world. And especially because of the rise of this other system that is creating its own series of institutions. But from the European Union, because we exist because of norms and institutions, I think that there are issues that are happening here with all the problems that I have said of us not knowing what we want to do together, making big blunders, and just in the 11th hour picking up our stamina and and going forward. But it's there. I think that there is a new kind of concert, like with frameworks approach, with based on values, based on principles that are the liberal principles, the liberal values, but that we will have to just to bring forward as far as we can, and in some areas we will need to work with a system that has nothing to do with ours. And again, I'm very much looking forward to this bilateral meeting next week, because I hope that we will dispel the ambiguities. Because what is the ambiguity for the European Union? We pretend sitting on the fence. We don't go. This is this idea of my way, the Sinatra doctrine, going my way. No, the European Union, it's not true. We cannot go our way. We cannot just put on equal footing our relationship with the United States and our relationship with China. It doesn't make sense. But at the same time, there is a lot of psychological and a lot of pedagogy to be done with the Europeans, because honestly, deep down, we really don't trust the stability in the thrust, the international thrust of the United States. And as I say, there is an opportunity now. We had a very clear example that we didn't trust the United States or a new United States when we signed at the last day in July, after we knew that there was a clear possibility that President Biden would win the elections, and we went forward with the investment agreement with China, that frankly, if we see this big picture, it would make sense to coordinate with the United States in this area, in climate change policies, in so many areas of common interest. But again, and I finish there, we need to recover trust and to recover this level of exchange, feeling that we understand that the convening power is the United States, but the United States cannot take us for granted, take decisions on Afghanistan without saying anything, deciding on the patents without even saying, here we go. This is the kind of things that we have to avoid in order to get to this new conference of power, a new conference, diplomatic conferencing that you called.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you again, everybody. We have a few questions already, and I'll add some of my own. One is a question from another Egmont colleague, François Roux, who asked for this to work. Does not the quest for superpower status somehow need to disappear? Can concert diplomacy work if the US does not sort of give up this idea that it should be the undisputed number one? And of course, then if China somehow gives up its aspiration to maybe become the new number one, assuming that that is its aspiration, which not everybody is convinced of. A second related question is whether a first priority for a concert or a group of nations could not be to reform the United Nations. Question specifically addressed to Chester, but feel free if others want to pick it up. Notably, it says here to reform the decision making, and I will add an issue of my own. There's a lot of debate, and Anna already alluded to it now, about what you can and cannot do with actors that have a society and a state based on another value set. And it seems to me that we often still confuse things. On the one hand, we say we have to work together where interests overlap, and we have to somehow keep all the powers involved in running the system. Otherwise, they will turn against the system. And then at the same time, we say, but we cannot work with you together because you don't respect human rights. And how do we reconcile that? Where is the juste milieu in this to be found? A difficult discussion, and before one knows it, and I'm speaking from experience, when someone is accused of being cold-hearted and either ignoring human rights or being a fellow traveler of China, neither of which is the case for me. Let me hasten to add, but this requires some maybe clear-headed thinking. Might I suggest that I turn it back to our three co-editors of the book first and foremost? Whoever wants to go first, Pamela, Chester, or Fen?
I'm happy to take a crack at a couple of these points, but I would urge my co-editors to jump in as well. There used to be a sign on President Ronald Reagan's desk that said, there is no limit to what we can accomplish if we're not all grabbing to get the credit for it. And that kind of speaks, I think, to the first question, Sven, that you raised. I think it's very important for us to be able to lead on some issues, we in the US, to lead on some issues, but to promote and support and even initiate having others take the lead where that's appropriate and where they want the lead. So I personally, when I look at the situation of peacekeeping, which is written about in our book by Lise Howard, the Chinese have stepped up a lot. And Nina, I know you'll have a view on this. The Chinese have stepped up a lot on the support for UN peacekeeping. In principle, that should be something we welcome, as long as they don't subvert the basic norms that peacekeeping is supposed to accomplish. So having the Chinese pay more for the budget of UN peacekeeping and even deploy some of their troops, okay. It shows that they want to be seen involved in global governance of a certain kind, but with what effect, with what impact on the local situation? On the question of UN reform, I think we all know that it's needed. The charter needs revision, but you have vetoes on revision. Japan should be a member. India should be a member, but there are vetoes in these cases that will prevent that from happening. So how do we get there? Well, the suggestion might be that we get there by a spontaneous eruption on the floor of the General Assembly. I'm not sure how that works, but I open the floor to others to comment on that. Your question, Sven, is a very difficult one. Can we do human rights and also pragmatic cooperation? We have to be able to do pragmatic cooperation on things like cyber and space. We need rules of the road on space. We need rules of the road on cyber. We have some rules of the road on counterterrorism, although Dan points out that that's limited and that there's state-sponsored terrorism too. So I think we have to choose our issues and not have one single model. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Chester. Fen or Pamela, you want to add?
Sure. You know, to the question, can others take the lead other than great powers in concert-like initiatives? I think the answer is a qualified yes. An interesting example would be the efforts by Canada to launch a declaration of arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations. That was the subject of a recent G7 meeting of foreign ministers, where all 7 countries have signed on to that declaration. It's very much normative, but there are, something like 50 countries that have signed it. We'll see if it has teeth going into the future. There's certainly been some discussion about, can you put sanctions behind it? But, that's an example where, a country like Canada that was, facing a very specific problem with 2 Canadians who were detained by the Chinese, has launched, a global effort to try to change state behavioral norms in this space. And there are earlier examples. I mean, back in the 90s, the campaign to ban landmines, it began initially as an idea by the Clinton administration, but then as the Pentagon got cold feet, Canada, Norway, eventually a group of other European countries, pushed that initiative. They took the conversation out of the UN Conference on Disarmament. That was really the sort of Ottawa Treaty process, but then sort of took once they had a convention, took it back into the UN. And I think that's a good illustration of how you can use a variable geometry approach to pursue initiatives. There's a group now that is trying to do the same thing with an anti-corruption international court that would accompany the International Criminal Court to deal with the problem of corruption. Now that started very much as an NGO led effort, but it's in the process of trying to get states behind it. So the short answer is yes, others can do it, but at the end of the day, you do want the great powers to come and play ball. And as Anna said, I think one of the big problems right now as we talk about the return of U.S. leadership is it credible? Is it believable, given the state of domestic politics in the United States? I don't think anyone can answer that question. Nobody can predict the trajectory of domestic politics. I think, trust is something that, as we all know, is easily destroyed. Takes a while to rebuild, but I wouldn't rule it out. I think, the United States is resilient. It has lots of soft power, as Joe Nye says, and I certainly wouldn't say that its leadership is in permanent decline. There are episodes of decline, there are episodes of resurgence and return.
Thank you, Fen.
And just to add on a little bit to what Fen was saying, pointing out that the Landmines Treaty actually had a very strong NGO component as well. So I think to get too tied down with this idea that a concert has to involve the great powers takes away from the very interesting experimentation that one is seeing at the regional levels, where regional organizations are in fact sort of establishing the rules of the road for great power involvement in their regions. It's still early days there, but you look at the work that the AU is doing in trying to establish a structure. Doesn't always work, but establish a structure and the rules of the road for Africa, in terms of subsidiarity and who takes the first step in responding to conflict. So perhaps these are smaller concerts. Perhaps, in fact, they are concerts that we haven't yet heard the full musical range of them, but they are coming along. Secondly, your question, Sven, about human rights and cooperation. This is the age-old issue that conflict management and conflict resolution has been dealing with since its beginning. And there has been tension between the human rights community and the conflict management community over, sequencing or who comes first or what gets privileged. And, often the conflict management community is criticized for ignoring human rights. So I think we can learn a little bit from that episode, but I'm actually thinking that where it lives is directly in the middle of where Dan Benjamin has been writing, because obviously the counterterrorism activities can infringe a lot on the rights of privacy, and I think there's been a lot of criticism about counterterrorism measures that are very intrusive in ordinary citizens' lives.
Thank you. Meanwhile, we have more comments from Ton van Os, the former Director General of the military staff, who asked, is there much of a difference between, I think, Anna, if you could please mute yourself. So a question from Ton van Os, who asks, is there really much difference between the idea of a concert and what we see often, that when there's a crisis, a couple of big countries plus some others form a group to address it? I suppose part of the answer is here that we are indeed hoping to see concerts of rivals, not only of like-minded, but that we get on board not just those whom we like, but specifically those whom we don't like. And this is why personally, for example, I'm a bit allergic to the idea of an alliance of democracies. Creating an alliance of democracies, that's the easy bit. We can do that this afternoon. It's to getting the others into our alliances or our partnerships that is more difficult, I think. And as a question from Jos van Schoenwinkel, who asked, I'll summarize, if human rights becomes an excuse not to have good relations, how will we ever have peace? Picking up on where Pamela left off, I think. Perhaps to build on that, and that's really the final question before I turn it briefly back to the three editors, then we'll have to close. If indeed, are we not too often projecting our own fears or maybe our own histories on some of the other actors? I mean, speaking as a European, I think most European countries, when they amassed a bit of power, somehow the urge was then always to use that to conquer someone else. That doesn't mean that necessarily every new actor in Asia or elsewhere that amasses power is necessarily set to conquer the world. Perhaps they have also learned a bit from our mistakes in the past and have other projects now. But that's a very big and open question. Might I suggest that Chester, Pamela, and Fen as the editors, if they want to give us some brief concluding remarks or the one idea that you want us to remember, or to say this is really why you need to read the book, and then we can close on that note. Thank you.
Pamela, Fen, do you want to speak?
Well, I just want to put out the really compelling reason to read the book is all the chapters that are written by the points of view of either from regions or from the functional issues we carried. And you heard from Anna about Europe, you heard from Dan about counterterrorism. There are other chapters that are equally interesting that cover other issues in other parts of the world. So do read it.
Thank you. Chester or Fen, please.
Certainly, I think one of the strengths of the book is the global diversity of contributions. We really have tried to reach beyond the North American or transatlantic community of scholars. So I would say that that's one strength of the book. And And the second strength is that it does do a deep dive in the different chapters, but also the contribution of the three editors to looking at, and Chet talked about this, the different kinds of diplomacy, whether it's governance diplomacy, stabilization diplomacy, and you know, where it can be applied most effectively. So it does have policy, real policy relevance.
Thank you, Chester. That means that de facto you have the final word for today, at least.
Well, I'm going to pick up on what Fen was just talking about on governance diplomacy, because there's two kinds. There really should be, we should think of two kinds of governance diplomacy. One kind is diplomacy that is trying to influence the way individual countries govern themselves. That's internal governance diplomacy. So for example, over Venezuela or over Northern Ireland, but there's also international governance diplomacy. And that's, I think, a very important distinction to be made. Ana Palacio made several interesting comments about the role of Europe as keeper of the flame. I'm going to hold on to that concept, Ana. I think it's great. Europe as the keeper of the flame. And, you know, you're right. It certainly was. On the JCPOA, Europe was the keeper of the flame. On the Paris Climate Accord, perhaps as well. So let's keep in mind the possibility that we can learn from these kinds of experiences. There's a tendency in today's world, Sven, to focus on failure and decline and gloomy scenarios. I think we learn more from our successes than we learn from our failures. And the area of counterterrorism is a good one to think about. But there are others where we have seen that successes actually are possible and we can build on them. So the JCPOA may come back, at least in some form, as a building block, if nothing else. So we should keep that in mind, I think, Sven, is to look around the world at successes, successes of concert diplomacy. If there is now peace in the Philippines, in the southern island of Mindanao, it's because of a kind of concert diplomacy that involved NGOs, sovereign states, regional organizations, as well as the government in Manila. It's extraordinary what's happened in Mindanao, and it's a direct result of a kind of concert diplomacy. I would like to see it replicated in the Horn of Africa, but Nina, you're the expert there, and I don't know if you want to comment on that, but we need concerts in lots of places. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, all of you. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but this just means that there was a whole lot to discuss and a whole lot of food for thought was offered. It was our pleasure at Egmont to host you. I think this is an important book. That's why we really were keen to organize something around it. I'm definitely looking forward to dive into it myself. So thank you to the audience. Thank you also for the questions. A warm thank you to all of our speakers. And I hope that the next time we meet, we can meet in person, and that I can continue what used to be Egmont practice, is taking you out for a huge and hearty Belgian dinner. Thanks a lot, and a nice rest of the day wherever you are. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.